Walt Draggett grabbed Callie's wrist so hard the ladle clattered into the dirt. "I said, my coffee's cold." He didn't raise his voice. That was the worst part. He said it the way a man says, "Move, dog." Without anger, without even the courtesy of anger. Just the flat certainty that she didn't matter enough to be angry at. Every cowhand at that fire went quiet. Callie didn't pull away. She didn't cry. She stood there, 22 years old, her husband 4 months in the ground, her hands cracked from weeks of pre-dawn fires and iron pots, and she looked at the man gripping her wrist like she was a piece of equipment he'd found fault with. And somewhere across the camp, a pair of dark eyes watched the whole thing. If you've ever stood in a room where someone treated you like you were nothing, and you had no choice but to take it, then you already know exactly how Callie Marsh felt in that moment. What you don't know yet is what happened next. Stay with us, because this is only the beginning. The morning Callie Marsh buried her husband, the ground was still frozen. January doesn't usually freeze hard in the Texas hill country, but that year it did, and the men digging the grave had to break the earth with pickaxes instead of shovels. She remembered the sound of it. A sharp crack over and over, like something being split open that was never supposed to be opened at all. She stood at the edge of the hole in her good dress, the green one Daniel had liked, and she thought about practical things, because practical things were the only ones she could hold without falling apart. The hem needs mending. The flour barrel is nearly empty. I have $9.60. Daniel Marsh had been 24 years old. A good man, in the plain way most people mean it. He showed up. He worked hard. He was kind when he didn't have to be. He'd married Callie when she was 19, and they'd just begun building something, a rented plot outside of Waco, a few laying hens, a list of plans made lying in bed at night, the way young people do, not yet knowing that plans are just wishes with better posture. Then a green colt threw him in November. He lingered 3 weeks before the injuries won. She was 22 and alone in a house she couldn't afford. The neighbors were kind for exactly as long as neighbors can afford to be. The preacher's wife brought stew for 2 weeks. A man from town offered a fair price for the hens, and she took it because she needed the cash more than the eggs. By February, the kindness had dried up quietly, the way creeks do in summer. Not all at once, no dramatic moment. One day you look and the water's just gone. She tried the dry goods store. They'd already hired a boy from the next county. She tried the boarding house. The widow who ran it was sorry, but didn't need help. She asked at the telegraph office and got a look she'd remember for a long time. The particular look that says, "We were never going to hire you, but we were too polite to say why." The truth was simple and hard, the way most true things are. A 22-year-old widow with no family close by, no obvious skill anyone could see from the outside, and no man to vouch for her, wasn't exactly first in line for anything. What she could do was cook. She'd been doing it since she was 7, standing on a stool beside her mother in their kitchen outside Fort Worth. She could stretch a ham bone into 4 meals. She could bake bread in a Dutch oven over open coals. She could feed a crowd out of whatever happened to be on hand, and she never burned the same thing twice. She learned from her mistakes the first time because she couldn't afford to make them twice. So when she heard a cattle outfit heading north was short a camp cook, she didn't hesitate long. She hesitated exactly long enough to feel afraid. Then she folded that fear up and put it in the same place she put everything else that might undo her. Somewhere behind her ribs pressed flat, and went to find the man running the drive. His name was Nathaniel Calloway. She didn't meet him that first day. She met his foreman instead, a lean, sun-cured man named Sackett, who looked her over with the professional disinterest of a man pricing cattle. "You cook for 30 men. I cook for however many men you've got." Sackett scratched his jaw. "Pays $14 a month. You ride the chuck wagon. You don't go near the herd. You stay in camp, you feed the crew, and you keep your mouth shut about anything that ain't breakfast, dinner, or supper. That agreeable, it wasn't entirely agreeable. But $9.60 wasn't going to last, and she had nowhere else to be. Yes, she said. We leave Thursday. She left Thursday. The chuck wagon was a battered old thing, older than it looked, and heavier than anything had a right to be. The last cook Sackett told her, without much ceremony, had broken his arm falling off a supply crate and was done for the season. No notes, no inventory, no handover of any kind. She climbed up into that wagon with the supplies exactly as they were and spent the first 6 hours counting what existed, what would last, and how in the world she was going to feed 31 men 3 times a day for the next 2 months with what she had. It wasn't plenty. It was enough if she was careful. She was always careful. The crew didn't exactly ignore her. They ignored her the way people ignore furniture. They moved around her. They used her. Vaguely grateful when she was useful, vaguely irritated when she wasn't. Most of them didn't use her name that first week. She was "Hey Cook" or "Girl," and once from a young drover who probably meant it kindly, "Ma'am," in a tone that made him sound like he was talking to somebody's grandmother. She learned their names anyway. Not to make friends, because it helped. Which ones drank their coffee black, which ones needed it sweet. Which one had a bad tooth on the left side and couldn't chew anything hard. Which ones were homesick and needed a bigger plate without being asked. Small information, nothing grand. She filed it all away and used it quietly. Nobody noticed. That was fine. She hadn't come out here to be noticed. The trail boss Calloway she saw mostly at a distance those first days. Always somewhere else, riding the flanks, talking with Sackett, making the 100 daily decisions that kept 2,000 head of longhorn moving in the right direction without killing anybody. Not a young man, not old either. Somewhere in his early 40s, she guessed. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had stopped being surprised by things some years back and was just working through whatever came next. He came to the fire for meals like everyone else. Took his plate, ate fast, left. Didn't make conversation. Neither did she. The first time he actually looked at her, really looked the way you look at a person and not just an obstacle in your path, was the 4th morning out, when she was up at 4:15 and he came to the fire a full hour before anybody else. She didn't say anything. She handed him a cup of coffee. He took it, looked at her, looked at the fire, looked back at her, said nothing, drank his coffee, and walked off. She went back to her biscuits, but she noticed later, much later, she'd be honest with herself about this. She noticed that when he walked away, he walked a little slower than he needed to. The trouble with Walt Draggett was that he'd been allowed to be Walt Draggett for far too long. One of those men who'd spent years on cattle drives, which meant years in a world with no real consequences for how he treated anybody below him. He was a good hand, she'd give him that. She wasn't unfair, and on the trail being a good hand bought a man a lot of tolerance for everything else. He started in on her the 2nd week. Nothing dramatic, it never is. A cold plate left too long between when she set it down and when he came to fetch it. He shoved it back across the tailgate without a word, a look that said again and better. She reheated it without comment. Then it was his coffee made wrong, though she'd made it exactly how she'd been told the crew liked it. Then it was the way she'd arranged the supplies on the tailgate, which he rearranged without asking, and when she moved them back to where they were efficient for her reach, he rearranged them again and said, loud enough for the men nearby to hear, "Can't even keep a wagon straight." The men nearby didn't say anything. One looked at the ground. One found something very interesting in the middle distance. Callie kept her face still because she'd learned that a still face was the only reliable defense against a certain kind of man. You didn't give him a reaction. You didn't give him anything to aim at. You just went blank and waited for the moment to pass. The moments kept coming. The night with the wrist was the 9th evening out. She'd been up since before 4. Cooked breakfast in the dark, cleaned up, served the noon meal off the back of a moving wagon, made camp, cooked supper for 31 men, and was scrubbing the last pot when Walt came back for a second cup and found the pot gone cold. She was already reaching to reheat it. He didn't wait. He grabbed her wrist, not violently, and that was the precise, horrible thing about it. He grabbed it the way you grab a doorknob, mechanically, without malice, but also without the slightest acknowledgement that she was a person who might have feelings about being grabbed. I said, "My coffee's cold." The camp went quiet. She heard the fire. She heard cattle somewhere in the dark, that low, restless murmur they made at night. She heard her own blood in her ears. She did not cry. She was furious, silently, at the sting behind her eyes because she had not cried in front of another living soul since Daniel's funeral, and she was not about to start now, not for Walt Draggett. And across the camp, maybe 20 feet off, Nathaniel Calloway set down his coffee cup. She didn't see him stand. She didn't see him cross the fire. She only knew he was there when Walt's grip vanished from her wrist and the silence changed, got heavier, more specific, more directed. She looked up. Calloway was standing between her and Walt, not touching anyone, not squared up in the exaggerated way of men who want the look of a fight without being in one. Just standing there, and the stillness around him was the stillness of something very large that has not moved yet. He looked at Walt a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You touch her again. You're walking home. Not I'll fire you, not you're out of line, just you're walking home." 5 words, and a tone that made it plain he meant every one of them with the full weight of his authority, and had already decided he didn't care what it cost him to follow through. Walt's jaw tightened. Something moved through his face. An argument, start reconsidering itself, retreating. Coffee was cold, Walt said. But the edge had gone out of it. Calloway didn't answer. He just stood there until Walt took his cup and walked off. The camp breathed again. Calloway turned to Callie, not with pity, not with that particular softness men sometimes offer women in moments like this, which is really just another kind of condescension. He looked at her the way you'd study a map in bad light. "You all right?" She realized her right wrist was pressed against her apron, held there without her noticing, the way you do when something hurts and you don't want to admit it. "Yes," she said. He didn't push it. He nodded once and went back to where he'd been sitting. Later, alone by the coals, while the camp settled into sleep, she sat with what had happened. Not the ugly part. She had had enough of that. The other part. You touch her again, you're walking home. She'd had Daniel, and Daniel had loved her. But Daniel had been gentle and young, and his protection had always felt like something offered to her, something she had to receive carefully. What she'd heard tonight was different. It hadn't been offered. It had simply happened. The way a man walks to the edge of a cliff and stands there, not performing courage, just not especially concerned with the drop. She didn't know what to do with that yet. She banked the fire and went to sleep. There was breakfast to make before 4. The days took on a shape. Up at 4, fire lit by 4:15, coffee on by 4:30. She learned to distribute the noon meal, standing in the wagon bed while the wheels rolled beneath her, bracing her knees against the sideboard. She fell only once the second week, when a wheel caught a rut and threw her sideways. She caught herself on a supply crate and bruised her hip badly enough that sitting hurt for 3 days. She told no one. Supper was the meal that mattered, and she put everything she had into it every night, not to impress anybody, because she understood better than most people in that camp what a hot meal means to a tired person. She'd been tired long enough to know food was more than fuel. It was the thing that told you the day was survivable, that somebody had bothered. She started setting portions aside for the two youngest drovers' boys, really maybe 16 and 17, clearly off on their own for the first time, who'd been eating less than everyone else, the way people eat when they're too sad or too far from home to be hungry. Neither one said a word about it. Their color got better over the following week. That was enough for her. She started fixing things too, almost by accident. A torn seam on a quiet Texan named Frank who reminded her a little of her own father. She had needle and thread. She'd packed her own. She mended his coat one evening while he ate and left it on his bedroll without a word. He looked at it in the morning, looked around camp, found her at the fire, nodded once. She nodded back. That was it. Word moved through camp the way small things do without ever being said out loud. Calloway noticed. He noticed most things she was starting to suspect. "You don't have to do that," he said one evening, watching her mend a tear in a bedroll cover by firelight. "I know. Sackett didn't hire you to be a seamstress. Sackett hired me to keep the crew fed and functional. A man with a torn coat in 40-degree weather isn't functional." A pause. She heard him shift his weight. "Where'd you learn to cook like that? The stew last night?" She looked up because the question surprised her. Not a compliment, she'd had a few of those, the generic kind men give when they mean don't change anything. This was an actual question. "My mother," she said. "She was practical about food. Said you could make something good out of almost anything if you paid attention to what you had, instead of wishing for what you didn't." He was quiet a moment. "Smart woman." "She was," Callie said, past tense. He caught it. She saw him catch it and decide not to ask. "You're good at stretching supplies," he said instead. "Better than the last man was." "I know who he was. Sackett mentioned him." "Right." Another pause. "I'm saying it's been noticed. What you're doing. I'm not sure enough people have said that." She looked back down at her mending. Most people don't notice the things that keep them alive. They just stay alive and figure it was going to happen anyway. She wasn't sure where that had come from. It came out sharper than she meant, and she braced for the awkwardness of it, but Calloway made a sound that might have been a quiet laugh. "That's accurate," he said, and got his coffee and left. She sat with the warm, strange weight of that for the rest of the evening and tried not to examine it too closely. The storm came on the 14th day out. She felt it before she saw it. The air changed. The wind shifted twice in an hour, then died altogether, that particular dead calm that means something is gathering itself. She'd grown up outside Fort Worth. She knew what that stillness meant. She started preparing without telling anyone. She couldn't stop a storm. She couldn't keep the herd from sensing it and going nervy. What she could do was protect what was protectable. She reorganized the wagon, moved anything water could ruin to the center, wrapped the flour and cornmeal in extra canvas. She found the dry kindling she'd been quietly setting aside for 2 weeks, the good pieces tucked away every time they crossed a stand of timber, because she'd learned as a girl that the thing you'll need most is always the thing you forgot to save. She wrapped it tight, tucked it in the driest corner of the wagon under an empty crate. Nobody asked what she was doing. She was the cook. She was always doing something that didn't concern them. The storm hit at dusk, fast and mean. None of the theatrical build-up storms sometimes offer as a courtesy. 1 minute, a low purple line on the horizon. 20 minutes later, the wind was sideways, and the rain came in sheets that felt less like rain and more like the sky leaning its whole weight against them. The herd went sideways, immediately surging and pressing, filling the air with that deep, anxious bawling you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. The camp turned to chaos. Men who'd been grumbling about supper 10 minutes ago were now running, shouting, fighting to hold 2,000 head together in the wind and the dark. Fires went out. Shelters collapsed. Callie got the wagon cover lashed down. One tie had already snapped, and used a length of rope from the supply chest to make it hold with her own cold hands. Then she stood in the rain and looked at what was left of camp, and started thinking about what was possible. The fire was out, obviously. No ordinary fire was coming back in that wind. But she had dry kindling. She had the big cast-iron pot heavy enough to hold its ground. She had 3 sides of the wagon for a windbreak if she set it right, and the small triangle of shelter between the front wheel and the wagon bed. It wasn't a fire she was building, not really. Something smaller and more stubborn. Just enough flame under that pot, the pot itself keeping the wind off the flame, the whole arrangement barely working, and working enough. It took her 40 minutes and everything she had. By the time the men started straggling in from the herd in small, exhausted knots, she had coffee. Hot coffee. Not good coffee, she'd had to guess at the water in the dark, but hot and there, and the beans she'd started that afternoon were back to a simmer, which meant food was coming too. The first man to reach the fire was the younger of the 2 drovers, 16 years old, from somewhere outside San Antonio, name of Tommy. Soaked clean through, hands shaking, he stopped dead when he saw that small, impossible, stubborn little fire. "How dry kindling," she said. "Cup." He took it with both hands and held it against his chest before he even drank. She looked away before that could mean too much. They kept coming in, she kept pouring. Ran out of cups, men drank out of whatever they had. She served beans to a dozen men before the pot ran low, stretched what remained with water and salt pork, and kept it going. Calloway came in close to midnight, soaked through his face, carrying the controlled blankness of a man who's been managing a crisis for hours and is still managing it internally, even with the worst of it past. He stopped at the fire the same way Tommy had, that same fractional pause. He looked at the fire. He looked at the pot. He looked at her. She poured him a cup. "There was no dry kindling in this camp," he said. "There is now. You prepared for this." "I prepared for something. I grew up outside Fort Worth. You learn." He drank his coffee, stood there by that small fire a moment longer than he needed to. "The crew's going to need to know this wasn't luck. Doesn't matter what they think it was. It matters to me." She had nothing ready for that. She looked at the fire instead, adjusted something that didn't need adjusting. "You should eat," she said. "Beans are thin. I had to stretch them." "I've eaten worse." He took his beans and sat down nearby instead of going back to his usual spot on the far side of camp. The next morning came bright and cold and indifferent, the way it always does after a storm like that, like nothing happened. The camp was a wreck. One shelter had collapsed entirely. 3 horses had pulled loose in the night, and Sackett was in a mood dark enough to cast its own shadow. But the crew ate a hot breakfast. Walt sat at the far edge of camp that morning, took his plate without looking at her, went back to his spot, said nothing. Not to her. Not about her. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She didn't feel much of anything. He was going to be what he was. She couldn't change him. She could only change what happened to her in response, and so far she seemed to be managing that well enough. What she did feel, and she examined it carefully because it was unfamiliar, was something like being seen. Not the spectacular kind, just 2 or 3 people in that camp were looking at her now with their actual eyes, instead of straight through her like she was a window. Calloway. Young Tommy. Frank, with his mended coat. Quiet Dewey, who'd started leaving extra firewood by the wagon without being asked, setting it there like it was nothing. Small things. She wasn't going to make them into more than they were. But she was 22, alone in the world, and had spent the better part of 6 months in varying degrees of invisible, being seen even a little even by exhausted cowhands who could barely remember her name, was not nothing. Calloway fell into a habit. She never knew exactly when it started, it just seemed to already be there once she noticed it. Coming to the fire first, before the crew staying those 10 or 15 quiet minutes, which became the quietest part of her day. And also, she was realizing the part she'd started organizing her whole morning around without admitting that to herself. He didn't talk much, neither did she. Sometimes he'd mention the day's route or a change in plan, practical things that touched her work. She'd ask something practical back. Some mornings they didn't talk at all. Just stood there with their coffee, watching the sky lighten. 3 weeks out, he told her about his children. She hadn't asked. He came to the fire in a mood that wasn't darker, just heavier, the way a man moves when something is pressing on him from the inside. "My daughter turns 8 next week," he said. "I keep thinking about that." "You have children?" "2. Molly's near 8, Sam's 10. He looked at the fire. "They're with my sister in Bozeman while I'm on the drive." Every year since their mother passed, he said it plainly, just a fact. 3 years ago. She was quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it, specifically with the understanding of someone who knew what that kind of loss did to the air in a room, or, in this case, the air around a man standing in a field at 5 in the morning. "Molly doesn't sleep well," he said. "Sam does, but Molly—" "I get letters from my sister. She doesn't say it outright, but I can read between the lines." He drank his coffee. "It's harder to be gone than it used to be." "Then why do you do it?" She didn't mean it as a challenge, it was a real question. He looked at her like he was deciding how much honesty he had available at that hour. "Because the ranch doesn't run without capital, and capital doesn't come without the drive, and the kids need the ranch still standing when they're old enough to run it themselves." A pause. "Their grandfather built it. I'm not going to be the one who loses it." "That's a lot to carry alone." "Most things worth carrying are heavy," he said. Not philosophy, just what he believed. 2 days after the storm, Walt tried once more. Not at her directly. He said something to the man beside him at supper loud enough to carry, about women on cattle drives being bad luck, about the storm proving his point about how some people ought to stay in town where they belonged. He never looked at her while he said it. He didn't have to. The camp went careful and quiet. Calloway was across the fire. He didn't move. Didn't even look at Walt. He just said in that same calm voice she'd heard him use on a green horse about to bolt low-level no air in it for negotiation. "Walt, stop." 2 words. Walt stopped. She served the rest of supper without a single man meeting her eyes. And she understood why. They weren't looking away because they didn't care. They were looking away because they were embarrassed. And men have a hard time with embarrassment that doesn't have a target they can hit. That was all right. She didn't need them to look at her. She needed them to eat. They ate. Later, cleaning up alone, she thought about what it cost Calloway to do that. Not the act itself. One cold sentence to a difficult man wasn't much of an act for someone like Nathaniel Calloway. But the consistency of it. He'd done it once in front of everyone, and then again quietly without any performance. The once could be pride, or authority, or a dozen things. The twice was something else. The wildfire started on a Thursday. She smelled it before she saw it. That specific smell of burning grass, thinner and faster than wood smoke, with a heat underneath it that seemed to arrive before the fire itself. She looked south. Smoke on the horizon, already pale and low and moving fast. The wind had been strong all morning out of the southwest, driving whatever was burning straight toward them. "Fire!" she shouted. "Fire south!" The camp erupted. The herd caught the smell seconds behind her, and the low, settled murmur of 2,000 resting cattle turned instantly into something louder and more urgent. And then the decision came, and they surged north away from the smoke in a wave. Nothing on earth was going to stop. From the front, the chuck wagon was loaded with everything: food, ammunition, medical supplies, spare harness. If the fire reached it before she moved it, the powder would go up, and the blast would be worse than the fire itself. She grabbed the reins, got the terrified team loose from their picket, hauled them hard, fighting the animals every foot of the way, talking low and constant, the voice that worked better than shouting. Just sound, just presence. "I'm here. I'm telling you where to go." She got the wagon 30 feet before a wheel caught a shallow wash and stuck fast, and the horses were past managing alone, and the fire was close enough now that she could hear it. Nobody tells you that a prairie fire sounds like something tearing, continuous, vast, mechanical. She threw her weight against the wagon bed and screamed the horses forward until the wheel broke free, and then she was moving again. And she looked back over her shoulder and saw the wind had shifted just enough, angling the fire toward the stretch of dry grass where Calloway had been working the herd. She got the wagon to a clear patch of shorter grass, tied the lathered team to a scrub oak, not a good tie, but enough for 30 seconds, and looked out across the smoke and the chaos. She saw Calloway's horse go down. She never was sure exactly what happened. The horse was there, and then it wasn't, and Calloway was in the air, and then on the ground, and the herd was going to be on top of him in no time at all. She moved before she decided to move. She crossed the 20 yards to the wagon at a dead run, found the bullwhip Sackett kept coiled behind the seat. She'd never used one. She knew the basic mechanics, the way she knew a lot of things she'd never done, from watching, from paying attention, from the habit of learning things before you need them, because needing them first is too late. She'd seen Sackett use it twice. Turning a section of herd, the motion lived in the arm and the wrist. You didn't muscle it. You let the leather do the work. She ran toward the herd. She was not fearless. She wants that on the record, even if there's no one to record it for. She was genuinely, completely terrified. The hot, cold terror of a body that's done the math without being asked and doesn't like the numbers. She cracked the whip. First try a disaster. The tip never popped. The leather just fell. She adjusted, wrist, elbow, the motion starting from the shoulder, and tried again. The crack was enormous. In that space, in that dry air, in front of a stampeding herd whose only guidance at that moment was pure panic, it was enough. Sharp, sudden nothing at all, like fire. She cracked it again and again, moving along the edge of their path, never in front, never once in front, her arm burning by the third stroke, her voice raw with shouting. She couldn't even hear herself over. The lead animals pushed right. Not clean. Ragged and terrible cattle still streaming past close enough that she felt the heat and the wind off their bodies, close enough that one stumble put her in the worst place on earth. She didn't stumble. The main body of the herd shifted east. She held her ground at the edge of the river of hooves until it passed, and Calloway was not under them. She saw him at the edge of the clearing on his feet, one hand pressed to his temple, blood dark against his skin. Upright, looking at her. She lowered the whip. Her arm didn't feel like her own arm anymore. The fire was dying out on the eastern edge where the grass ran short. Men on horseback worked the flanks, pulling the stampede down to an exhausted stop. Calloway crossed the flattened grass toward her, moving with the careful gait of a man who suspects something's wrong with his balance and isn't ready to admit it. He stopped in front of her and looked at her a long moment, the way he had that very first morning by the fire, reading her. "Your hand," he said. She looked down. A burn red and already blistering on the back of her left hand, a spark she must have caught sometime in the last few minutes without noticing. "It's fine," she said, the automatic answer. "It's not fine." He took her wrist, gently, deliberately, nothing at all like the way Walt had done it, and turned her hand palm up. "We've got salve in the medical kit." "I know where the medical kit is. It's my wagon." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Right." Sackett rode back through the thinning smoke, scanning the wreck of the camp, doing arithmetic he didn't like. He pulled up beside Calloway, looked at Callie, looked at the bullwhip still coiled in her good hand. "She split the herd," Calloway said. "With that? Never used one before today." Sackett sat there a moment. He was not a man who showed surprise easily. Something moved through his weathered face anyway. He nodded once, slow, and rode on without another word. She understood that was the Sackett equivalent of a standing ovation. That evening, Calloway sat across the fire from her on the ground, instead of standing the way he usually did, holding his coffee in both hands, looking at the flames. "Where'd you learn to use a bullwhip?" "I didn't. I'd never touched one before today." He stared at her. This was she'd learned over the weeks, the Calloway equivalent of an open-mouthed gape. "You split a 2,000-head stampede with a tool you'd never used." "I'd watched Sackett use it. I understood the mechanics." "There's a gap," he said, "between understanding how a thing works and doing it in front of a running herd." "Yes, there is." He looked at her a long moment. "Were you scared?" She thought about lying, not to deceive him, just the old reflex, the habit of appearing more solid than she was. She didn't. "I was completely terrified," she said. "And you did it anyway." "You were going to die," she said simply. "So." He was quiet a moment that felt different from the other quiet moments. The fire popped. "I need to ask you something," he said. "All right." "My sister says the children need someone who's going to stay, not someone passing through." He looked at the fire, not at her. "I've been thinking about Montana, about what the ranch is and what it could be, and what it is right now isn't what those children deserve." He looked up. "I'm not saying this correctly." "I know what you're saying," she said. And she did. "I don't know enough about you. You know more than you think. Tell me something I don't know then." Not a demand, a genuine question. She thought about what was true that she hadn't said. "I love my husband," she said, "and I'm done grieving him. I'm not done missing him." That's a different thing, and I think it lasts longer. I'm not someone waiting to go back to what I had. What I had is over. Whatever's next is something different. She chose her words carefully. "I'm 22 years old. I spent the last 6 months learning how not to starve. And today I split a cattle stampede with a bullwhip. I don't know what I'm capable of. I'm still finding that out." "You're finding it out quickly," he said. "I'm being given material to work with." He almost smiled at that. "My children are difficult. Molly especially. She doesn't trust easily." "Neither do I." "I know," he said. And there was something in how he said it. "Not I've noticed that about you. I know because I'm the same." That landed differently. 2 days from the Kansas line on the last night of the drive, camp made on a flat stretch above a shallow creek, Walt Draggett appeared at the edge of her workspace while she scrubbed the last of the cook gear. She knew it was him before she turned the particular hyper-vigilance you build living near an unpredictable man long enough. "Good supper," he said. No warmth in it. The minimum investment a man makes when he's been told to say something. "Thank you," she said, flat as a weather report. He stood there another moment, jaw working. "You're all right on a trail drive," he said finally. It cost him something. She could see the cost in his face. Not remorse exactly, but the particular sourness of a man forced to recalibrate and resenting it. She didn't soften, didn't offer him anything to make it easier. "Good night, Walt," she said, and went back to her work. He left. She let out a breath she'd been holding since somewhere around the 2nd week. Later, at the wagon, Calloway found her doing the morning inventory. "There's something I want to say," he said. "I've been trying to find the right way for about a week, and I don't think there is one, so I'll just say it." A pause. "I want you to come to Montana, not as the cook. I'm asking you to come as my wife, if that's something you'd consider." The fire popped somewhere behind her. Everything else went quiet, with that particular totality that happens when your ears are still trying to catch up with what was just said. "You don't know me well enough for that," she said, the first thing her mouth found. "I know you better than I've known most people after a year," he said. "I've watched you work 6 weeks in conditions that broke men twice your size, and you never once complained and never once stopped. The one time a man put his hands on you, you stood there with more dignity than I'd have managed. And then you saved my life with a tool you'd never held before and told me your hand was fine, when it plainly wasn't." He paused. "What exactly am I missing? I'm 22. I know how old you are." "I'm 40. I know what it is," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't. I'm asking whether it matters enough to be the deciding thing." She looked at her bandaged hand. She thought about Daniel, which she hadn't done deliberately in several days, which felt like a significant thing to notice. She thought about the green dress. $9.60 and a rented house and a boy from the next county hired for a job she could have done better. She thought about Molly, who didn't sleep well, and Sam, who kept things folded up inside. "Tell me about them," she said. "Something real, not the summary." He sat down on the supply crate beside the wagon. Sat, which she noticed, meaning he'd decided this was going to take however long it took. Sam's practical. Too practical for 10. Started keeping a ledger when he was 8, tracking what the ranch spends on feed. His mother would have found that funny. A pause. He doesn't talk about her, acts like everything's fine. Then sometimes you see his face when he doesn't know you're looking, and it isn't fine, and I don't have a solution for that. "You're not supposed to have a solution," she said quietly. "He needs somebody to notice the face when he doesn't know they're looking, and not say anything, and just be there anyway." He was quiet. "Molly," she said. "Molly's 8 and has opinions about everything and will tell you each one in order." Something changed in his voice on his daughter's name. Not softer, exactly. More like the thing that lives under everything else in a parent's voice, surfacing briefly. "She's funny. Doesn't know she's funny, which makes it worse. She has nightmares and won't come find me for them because she doesn't want to wake me. Told my sister I've got too much to worry about already." Callie closed her eyes half a second. 8 years old, already managing her father's emotional load. "She sounds like me," she said. "I know," he said. "That's part of why I'm asking." She opened her eyes. He was watching her with that direct, undefended look. The one she'd come to understand was what his face did when he wasn't managing anything. Just there. Just himself. "I'm not going to be easy to live with," she said. "I have a temper when I see something unfair. I don't ask for help when I should. I form opinions quickly, and I'm usually right, and I'm not especially humble about it, all right?" "I mean it specifically. I heard you specifically," he said. "I've been married before. I know what not easy looks like and what it's worth when someone's honest about it up front." He looked at her. "I'm not easy either. I go quiet when I should talk. I assume I'm right, and sometimes I'm not, and I'm slow to admit it. I work too much. The ranch comes first, and I know that's a real thing to hand someone." "At least you know it." "Doesn't fix it." "No," she agreed, "but it's better than not knowing." The crew's send-off happened the following evening, the men scattering the next morning to their own lives. Calloway stood by the fire in the yard behind the boarding house the men gathered, loose and reluctant, the way men do at endings. Walt laughed, not the laugh of a man who's heard something funny. The specific laugh of a man wanting a room's attention, choosing the cheapest way to get it. "The cook," he said loudly. "He's looking at the cook." A pause, letting it land. "What's a man like Calloway want with a plain little cook from nowhere? That's—" He shook his head. "That's something." The yard went quiet. Not polite quiet, the specific quiet of people watching something and not yet sure what part they're playing in it. Calloway turned to Walt unhurried. "You want to say something?" Walt shrugged. "Just saying what everybody's thinking. No offense to the girl, but I'm going to stop you there," Calloway said. He didn't step forward, didn't raise his voice. He looked around the group slowly, and then he started to talk. He talked about the dry kindling and the storm on the 14th night, and the coffee that had no business being hot, and what that meant to 31 exhausted men coming in from the dark to find something warm waiting. He talked about the mended coats and the extra portions set aside for 2 boys too far from home to remember to eat. He talked about the wildfire the wagon moved before anyone told her to move it, the ammunition she'd thought to protect before he'd even thought of it himself. He talked about a bullwhip she'd never held, and 2,000 running cattle, and the fact that he was on the ground, and she didn't have any other options and didn't want any man there carrying the news home to his children. She was terrified, he said. I asked her, and she told me the truth. Completely terrified. And she did it anyway because that's what she does. That's what she's been doing since the first morning out. He paused. I've run 6 drives, worked with some of the best hands in Texas. And the best person on this outfit, the most reliable, the one who kept this camp together when everything else was falling apart, was Callie Marsh, who got paid $14 a month and never once asked for more. He looked at Walt. That's who you're laughing at. Walt said nothing. I've asked this woman to come to Montana and do me the honor of being my wife, Calloway said to the group. She hasn't answered yet, that's her right. But I want every man here to know, if she says yes, she comes as my equal and the lady of that ranch. Anybody's got an opinion about that, you can keep it. He looked back at Walt. Including you. Frank took off his hat. Nobody told him to. A few others did the same, one by one, not talking about it. Callie stood at the edge of the firelight and felt something move through her she didn't try to name. She was not a woman who cried in front of people, but her eyes were doing something she wasn't entirely in control of, and she let them, because there are only so many walls a person can hold up at once, and some of them eventually come down. Yes, she said, not loud, clear across the fire to the only person it was meant for. He crossed the yards toward her. You're sure, not pressure, checking. I'm not sure about anything, she said honestly. But yes. He held out his hand like a handshake, like a partnership. She looked at it. She took it. They shook once, firm, serious, and she felt something in that grip more intimate than a lot of things that look more intimate. All right then, he said. All right. The road north out of Kansas was nothing like the drive. Quiet, just the 2 of them and a single wagon with a hired driver named Otis, old enough that conversation didn't much interest him, which suited everyone. They talked in a way they hadn't been able to on the trail. She told him about growing up outside Fort Worth, the smell of her mother's bread, a smell she still associated with safety. He told her about Montana winters that could come in October and hold until April. He told her more about the children, better this time, more specific. Molly collected small rocks and kept them in her pockets until her aunt made her empty them. Sam had taught himself to whistle the previous summer, and now did it constantly, the same 3 notes over and over, and Calloway wasn't sure if it was a comfort or the most persistent small torture ever devised. Are you nervous? He asked her once, somewhere past the Nebraska line. Yes. About what specifically? Molly, she said. I think I understand Sam. Molly, I'm less sure of. Why Molly? Because Molly sounds like somebody who's already decided about things. And I'm going to be one of the things she's already decided about before I walk through the door. That's probably accurate, he said. I know. I'm not asking you to fix it, just answering your question. She's going to test you. Good, Callie said. I do the same. They were married in a town called Miller's Bend, 3 days south of the Montana line, by a justice of the peace in an office that smelled of old paper and boot leather. Otis witnessed. No flowers. She wore the cleanest dress she owned, not the green one. She'd left that folded on a shelf in the rented house back in Texas because she couldn't wear it anymore. And couldn't throw it away either. And leaving it felt like the honest thing. Calloway said his words steady the voice he used for everything that mattered. She said hers steady too. When it was done, they walked out into a cold spring afternoon. "Well," he said. "Well, you all right?" "I'm fine." Then she corrected herself because she'd told him she wouldn't lie about fine. "I'm a lot of things. I'm all right." He put his hand briefly on her shoulder. Not romantic. Just the contact of someone saying, "I'm here," in the only language he reliably spoke. Then they got back in the wagon and headed north. Montana arrived like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known existed. She'd thought she understood big country, growing up on the plains, 6 weeks on a drive with nothing but horizon. But Montana was different. Big without trying to be. Unself-consciously enormous, all rock and grass and distance that made the eye work harder than it was used to. The mountains appeared gradually over the course of a morning until they were simply present and seemed like they'd always been there and she'd just been too far away to see. The ranch sat at the end of a road that needed work. She noted that immediately, the way she noted everything, along with the leaning fence line on the north side and a barn that needed paint, the way things need paint when one person's been maintaining too much alone. The house was square and plain, and real smoke rising from the chimney in the afternoon light, because Calloway's sister had known to expect them and started a fire. That smoke did something to her low under the ribs. Someone had bothered. His sister Sarah came out before the wagon stopped. A few years older than Calloway, the same dark eyes, though on her the directness came out sideways instead of quiet. "You're smaller than I expected," Sarah said. "I get that. He said you split a cattle stampede with a bullwhip." "Never used one before." Sarah looked at her brother. "I like her." Then she went back inside, which was apparently the whole of the greeting, and which Callie found she liked very much. Sam was standing in the middle of the front room, positioned with the self-conscious deliberateness of a boy who's prepared for a moment and is now living through it and finding it different from the rehearsal. Taller than she'd imagined. 10 years old already, holding himself like someone older, shoulders back, chin level, working hard to look fine. She recognized the posture. She'd worn it for 6 months straight. "Hello," he said. "Hello, Sam. Your father told me about your ledger." Something flickered across his face, surprise, then real interest breaking through the formal readiness. "He told you about that?" "Said you started it at 8. "That's practical." "I like practical." He didn't answer, but the careful stillness in him shifted just slightly. She let it shift and moved on, because the worst thing you can do with a child holding himself carefully together is push at the seams. Molly wasn't in the front room. Sarah tilted her head almost nothing toward the hallway. Callie understood. The bedroom, then. Choosing not to come out. She didn't go after her. She helped with supper. She learned the kitchen its own logic, different from what she'd built from nothing in a chuck wagon, but learnable. Everything's learnable with attention. Sam appeared in the doorway wanting to help, but not knowing the protocol. 4 places, Callie said, not making it a thing. 4. He paused. It's all right. She can eat when she's ready. He looked at her a long moment, 10 years old, measuring her against some private standard. She does this, he said, when things change. I know, Callie said. So do I. He seemed to weigh whether that was a real answer or just a thing adults say, decided it was real and went back to the table. Molly appeared in the doorway partway through the meal. Smaller than Callie had pictured, even accounting for 8. Dark hair, dark eyes. Her father's eyes, exactly, the reading kind, taking in more than they gave out. Socks, no shoes, meaning she'd been lying on her bed. The slightly defensive posture of someone who's decided to come out of hiding but hasn't fully committed to the decision. Callie looked at her directly and said nothing. Not coldly. Didn't look away, didn't pretend she hadn't noticed. Just looked at her the way you look at someone you're willing to let set the pace. Molly looked back. The assessment was open, unguarded, the way children haven't yet learned to hide it. She was measuring Callie the way Sam had. But where his question was practical, is this person useful? Hers was something harder to name. Is this person going to stay? Callie held her gaze and didn't perform a warmth she hadn't earned yet. Molly came to the table and sat down. Sarah passed her the bread without comment. She ate. It wasn't a breakthrough. Those happen in stories more than in life, and Callie had learned from life. It was a hungry girl coming to a table where the food was, and the new person in her house wasn't trying to take it over. That was enough for one night. Sarah left 2 days later, back to her own family in Bozeman. She hugged her brother a long time at the wagon, the hug of someone releasing a fear that's no longer warranted. She shook Callie's hand, then apparently decided that wasn't right, and hugged her too brief and firm. "He's not easy," she said in Callie's ear. "I know." "You're not either, I think." "No," Callie agreed. Sarah nodded like that confirmed her judgment, climbed up and left. Then it was the four of them, and the house, and Montana. Sam thawed faster. She'd been right about him. Practical people respond to practical engagement. She asked to see his ledger the third day, and he brought it out with a restraint that didn't quite hide how much he'd wanted to be asked. They spent an hour going through the numbers together. Real questions. What had changed since he started patterns in the feed costs? Where was the biggest waste? He had opinions, good ones, specific and reasoned. The thinking of someone who'd been working through it alone for 2 years, with nobody to argue it out with. She listened to all of them. When she disagreed, she said so, and asked why, and let him push back, and showed him where his logic broke, and he sat with it, and finally said reluctantly, "That's fair." She understood then that Sam Calloway was going to be all right. He just needed someone to take him seriously. Molly took longer. Not hostility, exactly. She kept a careful, watchful distance, more exhausting somehow than open resistance, because it required Callie to keep existing in the space of being watched, without pushing back against the watching. She didn't try to make Molly love her. You don't make a child love you. You exist consistently in a way that makes love eventually possible, whether or not the child is looking. And you don't punish them for how long it takes. So she made breakfast before Molly woke, kept the house a little warmer at night than strictly necessary, because she'd noticed Molly kicked her blankets off in her sleep, checked on her once and found her cold without knowing it. Pulled the blanket back up, said nothing about it the next morning, or the second time, or the third. The fever came when Callie had been in Montana 6 weeks. She woke to a change in the air, not a cry, not a call, the way a house sounds different when something in it is wrong. Calloway was already awake beside her. "Molly," he said. Just the name. She was burning. Not warm burning, the fever heat of a body working too hard at something, skin tight and dry. Half-conscious mumbling something Callie couldn't make out. "I know," Callie said, even not knowing what she'd said. "I know. It's all right." It was not all right. She knew that too, and she used the calm anyway because panic was useless, and she didn't have the luxury of it. She sent Calloway for cold water, not ice, and cloths. Told him to build up the fire in the main room because warmth was going to matter once the fever broke. Told him exactly where in the kit she'd packed extra supplies during the resupply in Kansas, knowing she was headed north, knowing the winters would be hard, and the nearest doctor a long way off. He did it all without asking why, which she was grateful for. She sat with Molly through the night. Sam appeared in the doorway around midnight, his ledger-keeping face on, and something younger and more frightened underneath it. "She's going to be all right," Callie said over Molly's head. "I need you to sleep," she added. "I'm not tired." "I know. Go anyway." He stood there another moment. "Are you sure?" 10 years old, keeping his father's books, keeping his own feelings folded up small, working very hard to sound like he was only asking a practical question. She saw all of it because she had the same habit in herself. "Yes," she said. "I'm sure." He went to bed. Calloway didn't sleep, sat in a chair he'd pulled to the other side of the bed. The particular tension of a man who knows the right thing is to let someone else handle it and finds the letting hard. She understood that too, and let him sit there. The fever broke around 4 in the morning. She knew it before she checked. Molly's breathing changed, the tight, awful heat in her skin releasing, the way a creek breaks after ice. She was not the child's mother. Clear-eyed about that even in the middle of it. Molly had had a mother, and that mother was gone, and nothing was going to fix that. Not time, not warm houses, not unspoken blanket adjustments. That grief belonged to Molly, and would for a long time, maybe always in some form. Callie wasn't there to replace what was lost. She was there to be something additional. She didn't have a word for it yet. Maybe there wasn't one. Maybe it was a thing built over time instead of named up front. Molly woke proper at dawn, eyes clear, fever gone, exhausted and thirsty, and a little embarrassed the way sick people are when they surface and realize how helpless they'd been. "You stayed," she said, not quite a question. "Of course." Molly looked at her a long moment with those reading eyes. "My hair's sticky." "You had a fever. I'll help you wash it if you want." "Okay," Molly said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an acceptance speech. It was an 8-year-old girl asking, in the only way she was ready to ask, whether the person beside her was willing to do a small, ordinary, intimate thing that required some trust. "Okay," Callie said. She wasn't good at it. Got water in Molly's eyes once, and Molly made a sound of annoyance, and Callie apologized without over-apologizing and tried again. Worked the tangles loose with her fingers, slow, the way her own mother had done, and Molly sat still for it. That was the day things changed. Not all at once, but Molly stopped holding the distance after that morning. Let it go the way something dissolves once it's finished serving its purpose. What grew in the space it left was slow and imperfect and real. The summer was hard work. The ranch demanded everything, and Callie learned what she didn't know, which was a great deal by doing it wrong first, and then doing it better. The fence line on the north side finally got fixed in July after she'd mentioned it 3 times and gotten silence, and went and fixed it herself with Sam's help on the 4th day, which led to a conversation with Calloway that was one of their less comfortable ones, about what silence meant in that household, and what it meant to ask for something and get nothing back. Not a graceful conversation. He said she didn't give him time. She said she couldn't tell the difference between not yet and not going to. They were both a little right. They worked it out over 2 days of pointed quiet, and one long, honest talk that left them tired and clearer, which, she suspected, was how most of their real disagreements were going to go. She was fine with that. Fall came, and Molly started school in town 3 miles off, requiring a wagon ride every morning. Callie took it 3 days out of 5, and the rides became the thing, 25 minutes each way, just the 2 of them, the road, the mountains changing color in the distance. Molly talked about school, about a girl named Josephine she couldn't decide if she liked, about her mother sometimes casual mentions the way you mention someone who's part of your architecture. Callie let her mention her without turning it into a moment. In November, riding back one afternoon, Molly reached over and tucked her hand inside Callie's arm, the way children do when they're cold, and also when they want to be close and aren't ready to say so. Callie didn't make a thing of it, adjusted the reins so the arrangement could hold, and kept driving. That was the whole moment. It was enough. The first winter was brutal, the way Montana winters are, committed and serious and indifferent to inconvenience. She learned its rhythms, made mistakes, once misjudged the root cellar and cost them 3 weeks of potatoes, which made her furious at herself for the better part of a day before she put the fury away and worked out what to do differently. She wrote it down in a ledger of her own, started at Sam's suggestion, and kept with the same attention she'd once kept mental notes on the drive, only written now because she was building something meant to outlast her own memory. Calloway read it once without asking. She found it slightly displaced from where she'd left it. "The potato business," he said. "I knew a way to prevent that. Should have told you earlier in the season." "Yes, you should have. I'm sorry." She looked at him. Those weren't words that came easy to Nathaniel Calloway. She knew that by now. They cost him something. She accepted the cost. "I'll add it to the ledger," she said. He almost smiled. Right. By the end of that first winter, she'd found the shape of her life in that house. Not the final shapes change. Families aren't fixed things. They're living things, adjusting constantly to what's required. But the working shape, the honest one, the one that was hers. She cooked for people who were grateful, in the plain, inarticulate way of people who've learned to count on something. She fixed what needed fixing sometimes before anyone noticed it was broken. She sat with Sam over his ledger on Sunday evenings and argued productively about numbers and priorities, and sometimes he was right, and she told him so. She drove Molly to school and listened to the ongoing Josephine situation narrated with the intensity of someone documenting a significant political event. She and Calloway were not perfect together. She hadn't expected them to be. They misread each other sometimes. She went quiet when she should have spoken. He said the wrong thing at the wrong time with the bluntness honesty produces when it isn't careful enough. They'd figured out that morning's coffee before the day's demands took over were the best time for anything serious, and they kept that morning time the way she'd once kept dry kindling. Deliberately, knowing it would be needed. She still thought about Daniel. She'd told Calloway she would, and she did, and it was what she'd said it would be missing, rather than grieving the low, permanent ache of someone gone instead of the sharp, consuming loss of the early months. She had one photograph of him kept in a box with her few private things. Didn't hide it, didn't display it. Calloway had seen it once and said nothing, and she'd been grateful for the nothing. You carried people with you, you didn't replace them. You kept living alongside them even when they were gone, and eventually, the living alongside became part of who you were, instead of something you did in spite of the loss. She was 24 the March she understood this fully. Sitting at the kitchen table, snow still deep outside, but the light changed that particular shift in late winter. Light that's the only reliable early sign of what's coming. Molly asleep. Sam asleep. Calloway out in the barn doing something that needed a lantern. She was alone in the kitchen with her ledger and her coffee and the quiet, and she thought, this is my life. Not in the defeated way people mean it when they say, this is all I ended up with. In the other way, the way of someone who's looked around at what she built and can see it clearly. The imperfections included, the hard winters, the difficult conversations, the things still needing work, the grief that lives quietly alongside everything else, and can feel the solidity of it under her hands anyway. She'd come onto a cattle drive as a pair of hands nobody bothered to remember the name of. Widowed at 22, broke, invisible, certain in the part of herself she never showed anyone that the best she could hope for was to keep moving and not fall. She was not invisible now. She was not merely surviving now. She had split a stampede and weathered a storm and stood in the smoke of a prairie fire and said yes in a Kansas yard in front of a dying fire because a man had asked instead of assumed. And she had come north to a house full of grief and need and built it one careful, imperfect day at a time into something. She heard the barn door, boots on the cold ground coming toward the house. A sound she knew now the way she knew every sound in that house on that ranch, everything that was hers to know. He came in, stamped the snow off, hung his coat. "And he left?" he said, looking at the coffee pot. "Some." He poured a cup, sat across from her, looked at her ledger, didn't ask. She didn't explain. They sat there in the kitchen with their coffee and the quiet of a house where the children were sleeping and the snow was still on the ground and the light was changing. And Callie Marsh Calloway, who had been forgotten and invisible and alone, who had been widowed before her life properly started and built one anyway, out of dry kindling and stubborn practicality, and a plain refusal to be less than what she was, sat in that kitchen and was in the particular, uncomplicated way of people who have earned their place. Home. Not because someone had given it to her, not because anyone had rescued her or seen something in her she couldn't see herself, because she had shown up every single day and done the work and stayed. That was all it had ever been. That was everything. End.